Today's discussion is going to be on the topic of how to fight apathy. And, you know, we had a few days of cold weather here in Southern California, right, last week. Now, Baruch Hashem, as you can see, we're outdoors and we're able to enjoy some of the more California-like winter weather, 70 degrees or 73 or something like that. Um, But as we'll see, there's something called spiritual coldness or spiritual apathy, which is connected to this week's Torah portion, the portion of Beshalach. So in this week's Torah portion, we read about the Jews leaving Egypt. As we know, God shocked the entire world by sending the 10 plagues to the Egyptians and Pharaoh. God then split the Red Sea, and as the Medrash teaches us, not only was the Red Sea split, but every single sea throughout the world, every body of water split. So the entire world saw the hand of God at the splitting of the sea. Um, we know the manna came down from heaven, talks about that in this week's Torah portion. How you doing? No problem. Would you like a bottle of water? Okay. Um, and things started falling into place. The Jews were finally free, and now they were heading towards Mount Sinai. The entire world was intimidated and scared of the Jews, not because of their F-15 fighter jets, not because of some Golden Dome or other sort of weapons of mass destruction, but because they had the ultimate, the Joker, not the Joker, quite a serious one, and that is God Almighty on their side. And, you know, there was a guy at the same time. His name was Amalek. Amalek was the grandson of Esau. Esau was Jacob's twin brother. Now, Jacob passed away almost 200 years before the exodus of Egypt, and so did his brother Esau. In fact, it was the middle of Jacob's funeral that Esau's head got chopped off. That's a story for another time. But Esau, or Esav as he was known in Hebrew, harbored lots of hatred and resentment towards his brother Yaakov, and that good old anti-Semitism was passed down to his Eniklaf, to his grandchildren, and he had many children. He established an entire tribe, and one of those grandchildren was Amalek. Now, while the Jews were slaves in Egypt, nobody heard anything about Amalek. But Amalek, who lived in the southern point of Israel, or south of Israel, somewhere around the Eilat, came to the Sinai Desert in order to attack the Jews. And what's interesting is that the Jews hadn't even approached the area where Amalek was living. There was no territorial dispute. They weren't being accused of colonization or anything of that sort, which is the same as today. You know, the Jews aren't colonizing anything, but the hatred exists regardless. And here comes Amalek and says, let's fight the Jews. As it says in the 7th portion of this week's Torah reading. If you want to read in source 1, here we have the story of Amalek. Sylvia, you want to read that?
Amalek came and fought with the Israelites in Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, "Choose men for us and go out to battle Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." Joshua did as Moses told him and went out to battle Amalek. Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. When Moses raised his hand, the Israelites prevailed, but when he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. Moses' hand became heavy. So they took a stone and placed it under him, and he sat upon it. Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on each side, so that his hands remained steady in faith until sunset. Joshua weakened Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword.
Okay. So Moses tells Joshua, I want you to choose soldiers, go out to fight Amalek. And Moses says, I'm going to go up the hill to Mount Sinai, where I'm going to pray for the victory of the Jewish people. And Joshua weakened the people of Amalek and his people by the sword, which is, he didn't wipe them out entirely, he weakened them. Now, at first glance, it's like, okay, another chapter in their history. As we say in the Haggadah, it's another nation trying to fight us. What else is new, right? You know, even Pharaoh back in the day with Abraham tried to kidnap Abraham's wife Sarah. There's always another somebody, some smart aleck who's going to come along and think that they're finally going to make a final solution, and they fail again. Yesterday commemorated International Holocaust Remembrance Day, right? It's over and over and over again. But basically, we hope for better and we move on. But for some reason, God reveals an unusual level of anger and declares that he will erase the memory of Amalek from amongst the nations. And so the verses right after the ones we just read in source 2, it's very, very interesting. God said to Moses, write this as a remembrance in the book, the Torah, and repeat it in Joshua's ears, for I will totally obliterate. Actually, in the Hebrew, it's macho emcha. Obliterate, I will obliterate. In other words, totally obliterate the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. Moses built an altar and called it, God is my miracle. He said, the hand is on God's throne. God will be at war with Amalek for all generations. And that's just here in Exodus, in this week's Torah portion. But he ain't done. Comes back to Deuteronomy, and there's a clear commandment which we are commanded every day to remember, and to remember the evil of Amalek and to obliterate their memory for eternity. Look at source 3. You want to read source 3, Sylvia?
Remember what Amalek did to you on the way when you were going out of Egypt, when they chanced upon you and Ruth and struck down your appendage, all the feeble ones behind you, while you were exhausted and weary, and they had no fear of God.
Interesting how it mentions that they had no fear of God, as opposed to everybody else who was like, oh my gosh, these Jews, I mean, quite literally, oh my God, look at him splitting the sea for these Jews. Amalek disregarded that. Keep going.
God has given you repose from all your enemies around. In the land that God is giving you as territory to inherit, you shall obliterate the memory of Amalek from beneath the sky. Do not forget.
Okay. So it's actually a double commandment to remember, to obliterate the memory of Amalek, but also not to forget. So on the one hand, there should be no trace of Amalek, which means literally to kill any living descendant of Amalek. Now, practically today, the world is so gone through so much upheaval that we don't know who comes from who. So practically nobody could go around and kill anybody claiming that they're Amalek. That would be murder. But the point is, don't forget what Amalek did to you. Here's how Maimonides codifies it in his book of mitzvot. In source 4, we are commanded to remember what Amalek did to us and how they instigated and hate them constantly. We must encourage our nation to hate Amalek, so the mitzvah is not forgotten and the hatred does not subside. Wow. Somebody's feeling really triggered, right? That's what it sounds like. Like, why? I mean, Jews are known for loving each other, love, Avas Yisrael, love of God, love of Torah, love of our fellow person. And here's like, wow, very explicit hatred that we're commanded to have. Like, what's the big deal? Like, I mean, there's so many people, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Canaanites, that nobody else gets this special, the Egyptians, nobody else gets this kind of commandment. But the Amalekites, boy, oh boy, there's a special place in hell for them, right? So why is that? So let's hear what the Rebbe has to share about this topic. The Rebbe talks about chutzpah without reason. You know what chutzpah means, right? No, that's a chuppah. Chutzpah means like arrogance and disrespect and disregard. It's a Yiddish word that made its way into the English dictionary. How would let's see what Google says for chutzpah. Chutz, extreme self confidence, audacity, or nerve. Okay, love him or hate him, you have to admire his chutzpah, huh? Anyways, but chutzpah is usually not considered a good thing, a laudatory thing. So here goes. The Rebbe says like this on the bottom of page 2. The meaning of the mitzvah to remember what Amalek did to you can be explained as follows. The defining trait of Amalek is irrational brazenness, wielding power without a mandate. Amalek's opposition to the Jewish people was not based on any rational calculation. The Jews had not come to wage war against Amalek, unlike the 7 nations who had the concern of, quote, they are coming to destroy us and possess our land, end quote. Rather, Amalek came to instigate a needless war on their own initiative, motivated by resentment of the Jewish people's greatness and of the signs and wonders of the exodus from Egypt and the splitting of the sea. I was listening to an interview, some rabbi was talking about anti-Semitism, and he was saying how Jews are the only people who are hated because they're vermin and because they control the world. Which is an oxymoron in and of itself. But it just goes to show it's an irrational hatred, right? So that's the Amalek was motivated by resentment of the greatness and the signs and wonders that God made in the Exodus of Egypt and splitting the sea. Amalek possessed no special, neither wealth, anything. If I could add, they didn't have any oil. They were lowly and contemptible, not only in the eyes of others, but even in their own eyes. Nevertheless, they dared to rise and fight the Jewish people. This is something entirely irrational and unfathomable. So there were 2 reasons why they had a lot of chutzpah. They had chutzpah on 2 counts. First of all, Amalek, leader of this nation, came to fight the Jewish people without any cause. There were the 7 nations who at least knew that the Jews intended to inherit the land, the Canaanite lands, and so they had a reason, theoretically, to fight to defend their land. Now, granted, I disagree with that reasoning, because if God says it belongs to the Jews, you listen to God. But at least theoretically, you could understand why somebody might get up to defend their land. But Amalek didn't live in Israel, and they weren't on their way to Israel. So what did the leader of Amalek himself, what did he have to do with the Jewish people? He just came to fight, just to instigate a fight. So that's one level of chutzpah. Another level is Amalek had no special advantage. He didn't have a great army, a glorious kingdom. It was just a tribe, a family, a group of people living maybe in some Bedouin type tents in the middle of the desert. But yet, he had the chutzpah, he had the nerve to go and attack the nation that just escaped the most powerful army in the world, Egypt. Somehow, after the Jews escape Egypt and defeat the Egyptians, and they're all drowning in the Red Sea, that's when Amalek says, now might be a good time to fight the Jews. I mean, talk about picking your battles terribly, right? Now, again, I just want to clarify, there was a during the first Holy Temple in Jerusalem, there was a king by the name Sancheiriv who conquered most of Israel and many other places in the world. And he took the inhabitants of the lands that he conquered and had them do a population swap just to make them feel more submissive and under his rule. And that included 10 of the tribes of Israel, as well as many Gentile nations around that area, including Amalek. So anybody who comes up today and says, well, I'm a descendant from so-and-so, my DNA test shows that I was originally from the Sinai Desert, it doesn't tell us anything, because we don't know where they moved, when they moved, who their father was, who their mother was. There's no way to track anything like that. So on a practical level, there is no commandment today to go and seek out the Amalekites and kill them, as the Torah commands in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. We can't do that because we don't have a way to definitively prove that somebody's a descendant of that. So the mitzvah to obliterate Amalek doesn't apply on a practical level, but primarily on a spiritual level. So the 7 nations in the land of Israel, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Jebusite, the Amorite, etc., represent the negative forces that battle us in a rational way. So arguments, temptations, justifications, all those things that get in the way rationally of us doing what we need to do as Jews. But Amalek represents the fight, the negative force within us that fights without rhyme or reason, which is just brazen defiance for no reason at all. So the Rebbe continues here on page 3. At first glance, you want to just read that last paragraph on page 3?
This is puzzling. Why is there such a strong warning about Amalek? Such an emphasis on remember what Amalek did to you. With regard to the other nations, whose opposition is grounded in reason, there is a need for a warning that if someone comes and claims such and such, we should not be impressed, but should respond in such and such a way. But why is there a need for such an emphatic warning about the opposition of Amalek?
Right. In other words, most people, sorry.
In logic at all.
Yeah, most people, somebody tries to start up with you, you de-escalate, you get away and avoid the situation. But the warning against Amalek is so severe. So, spiritually speaking, the 7 nations that occupied the land of Israel represent the evil inclination within us that seeks to persuade us intellectually, rationally, to act in a way that is incongruent with the Torah. Now, that could be very tempting often because it can give us all sorts of reasons and justifications for not doing what the Torah wants us to do, right? We might say, for example, rationalize that kosher food is not good for your body, and there's other non-kosher, cheaper, healthier food, and therefore you should go for that over God's explicit commandment to eat only certain foods. Or you might get a better job if you didn't take off for Jewish holidays and the Sabbath, etc., etc. These are rational, incorrect, but yet rational reasonings that our evil inclination might tell us. And so we have an obligation to guard ourselves against those temptations. But Amalek comes along and fights without any intellectual reason. They present no argument. They construct no explanation, offer no justification. And the question is, why are we even concerned about such a temptation? It's like, I don't know. Just for example, have you ever had the temptation to just stand up from your chair and just run into a brick wall? It's just not tempting. There's no rationality for that. So it's like You don't need to put safeguards in place that people don't run into brick walls, right? It's just irrational. Why would you do such self-destructive behavior? And that's really what Amalek represents. It's this irrational, spiritual, self-destructive behavior that just tells you, oh, defy God. Why? What's in it for me? Nothing. Just don't listen to God, right? And that's a very it seems like something that most of us would not be susceptible to, that we're not going to fall prey to such a temptation, if you will. It's not very tempting at all, right? To say go eat some non-kosher food, it could look tasty, it can look delicious. I could see why that might be tempting. But to go run and bang your head on a brick wall, what benefit is there, right? So we have to understand on a deeper level, on a spiritual level, what the whole concept of Amalek represents. So in the next page, the Rebbe goes into this further based on the teachings of Hasidism. The Rebbe explains like this. Hasidut explains the verse, Amalek is the first of the nations. That's from a quote from Bilam, the prophet who came to curse the Jews. Said Amalek is the first of the nations. To mean that Amalek is the root and starting point of all the nations, meaning, in terms of divine service, all negative 7 character traits. More specifically, Amalek's effect is described by the phrase Asher Karcha, who happened upon you, which can also be read as who cooled you. The word karcha in Hebrew comes from the word kar, which means cold. Thus, the verse is saying that Amalek cooled off your heat. Before this, the nations of the world were afraid to fight you. When this one came, took the first step, and showed others that it could be done, this is illustrated by the parable of a boiling bath in which no person dares enter. When one reckless person jumps in, even though he is scalded, he cools it off for others, both physically and psychologically, if I may add. The person shows it isn't such a boiling bath after all, nothing to be concerned about, right? We all know that experience, that we're sometimes afraid to do something, and you have that first person who, so to speak, breaks the ice, or in this case, cools off the fire, and suddenly, whatever it might be is not so scary. This is why the Jewish people experience all future wars. Following their original state in which the chiefs of Edom were struck with terror upon those who were far and fear upon those who were near. Again, this is referring to when the Jews left Egypt. News spread like wildfire. Did you hear what happened to the Jews? They're finally free, and oh boy, did they put on a show, right? 10 plagues, splitting of the sea, horses, chariots going up and down in the water, gold, silver, jewelry ending up on the seashore. The Jews walk away with all the money that they weren't paid for their years of slavery. And word spread around the world about this. And everybody was stricken with fear. They got the message. Don't mess with the Jews. It was loud and clear. For this reason, says the Rebbe, we must be especially careful not to give Amalek any foothold, since they are the root and starting point from which all later undesirable developments emerge. So, what happened in the war with Amalek? At the exodus from Egypt, there was a revelation of godliness of the highest order. God revealed himself to the Jewish people before the eyes of all the nations and brought them out of Egypt with great miracles and wonders. The entire world was amazed, full of awe and astonishment, and recognized the greatness of the Jewish people and their God. And then comes Amalek and says, hold my beer. Well, they didn't say hold my beer, but even if they ultimately failed and were defeated, the very act of their provocation caused a shift in consciousness. They cooled off that sense of awe that everybody had. From that moment, the divine revelation no longer impacted the nations of the world with the same intensity, fear, and reverence that they had. All of that was diminished. Now, what's the possible metaphor that can apply to us? Any thoughts? what could be the metaphor of Amalek in today's day and age?
Like a cycle, cyclical, and it repeats over and over in every generation. So
Right.
like
So the hatred certainly repeats itself, but specifically that cooling effect. Where do we see that in our lives? So let me explain. Sometimes we may experience a revelation of godliness in our lives. A great miracle might happen to us, to a family member who's suddenly healed from a severe illness, maybe an extraordinary business success, some sort of salvation that comes clearly from God, something beyond the natural order. And it's only normal that when that happens, we become excited. We say, "Thank you, God." You even tell your friends and family, you should see the miracle that happened to me. And yeah, we use the word miracle in our everyday lives. That's like a thing that happens. And what does God want us to do besides for saying, "Wow, God is awesome"?
Baruch Hashem, we thank God.
We thank God, but what else? We change our behavior. We say, you know what? God sent me a lifeboat. Let me jump on board. Let me increase in my charity, in my prayer, in my Torah study, in the mitzvos that I do, because God did this for me. I got to give something back, right? Because we're all heated up with excitement, like, wow, it's amazing. Took a CAT scan, and after just a few rounds of treatment, it's gone. The illness is not there anymore. Incredible. And then here's what happens. Amalek knocks on our door. What does Amalek say? It wasn't really a miracle. You happen to get a good doctor. You should thank science. You know, you're, you should realize how smart you are that you invested in just the right stocks at just the right time. You should be glad for your success, but also give yourself a pat on the back because you did such good work, right? Now, where does this idea come from? The idea to shift the focus from thanking God to anything but God. That is the Amalek inside of us. That is the Amalek telling us, don't get too excited. Why? Because Amalek is afraid we might, actually devote our lives to God. And that's the last thing that the Amalek inside of us wants. Doesn't want that divine revelation should actually rub off on you and change the way you live your life for the better. So, source 5, the Rebbe talks here in a little bit more of a spiritual language. The Rebbe says that Amalek is etymologically Amal K. The Amal means effort, of the K. K is an acronym for Kalipa, which is the dark forces. Amalek's effort is to prevent a divine revelation from having an impact below. Their efforts are to hide the divine light. The word Kalipa actually means like a shell, a husk. Okay, I see you're well versed in Kabbalah. So the word Kalipa means a shell. So Amalek is Amal Kalipa, the effort of the klipa, of the shell, to cover over the divine light. So you had an incredible miracle in your life. Somebody in your family was cured from cancer suddenly, and you're like, wow, it's a miracle. Comes the Amalek, the work of the klipa, and says, here, let me cover that for you. I don't want you to notice God's hand in your life. Don't let that have too much of an impact. Chill out, relax. We can attribute it to other causes. So therefore, the Rebbe says we must therefore be especially careful not to give Amalek any foothold, since it is the root and starting point from which all later undesirable developments emerge. What the Rebbe is saying, in other words, is that when we allow ourselves to descend to a state in which a revelation of God no longer affects us, that becomes the root of all troubles. Every Jew I would say every person awakens at certain times in their life, whether it's in Shul on Yom Kippur, when they're standing with everybody right before the blowing of the shofar and declaring Hashem Hu Elokim, God is our God. And then they hear the shofar. Or whether it's reading the Haggadah on Passover night, or experiencing a miracle in their own family or for the Jewish people. Say, for example, the 12-day war in Iran, where we obliterated and severely damaged Iran's nuclear capacities with no casualties on our end, right? Whether it's the beepers of Hezbollah, where thousands of Hezbollah fighters were taken out. These are moments when our faith in God and our Jewish identity is restored and renewed. And then what happens is Amalek comes and says, let's insulate ourselves from that excitement. And by the way, I just want to clarify. Yes, maybe credit needs to be given to certain human beings, but at the end of the day, God is the one who is operating everything. Yes, he uses humans as his tools to get certain things done, but ultimately the thanks goes to God. That's why whenever we eat food, just something basic gets food. Do you send a letter to the farmer every time you eat a yellow pepper? No, but you do say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam borei pri adama, because ultimately God can get you the pepper with or without the farmer, and the farmer can't do anything without God, right? But then Amalek wants to insulate us from this excitement and pull us away from recognizing divinity in our Jewish experience, in observing God's hand in the world around us or within our own life or our own family. And when we insulate ourselves from that excitement, when we cool ourselves off from that excitement, that's the beginning of the end. And that's why we have to be so vigilant against this Amalek klipa, this shell, this husk, this blockage of holy excitement. The Rebbe continues here, we can add that when Amalek jumped into the boiling bath, I'm reading, by the way, on page 5. When Amalek jumped into the boiling bath, they themselves were scalded, which means physically they lost people, right? Joshua weakened them. Despite all this, at the very first opportunity, Amalek returned to wage war once again against the Jewish people, as the verse states, Vayishma Knani, and the Canaanite heard who dwelt in the south. This refers to Amalek, and he fought against Israel. This underscores even more how cautious we must be about Amalek. And this is also the lesson for every time and every place. Remember what Amalek did to you. We must know that we live in a world in which there is an Amalek force, irrational brazenness, chutzpah, unauthorized rule, devoid of any reason or logic. Even after it's scalded and suffers defeat, it returns and fights again. Therefore, we must be especially vigilant against it. Okay, you want to read on page 6?
To Amalek is specified in the verse. And Moses said to Joshua, choose men for us. What is the meaning of choose men for us? The war with Amalek was fought by Joshua, as it is written, and go out to battle in the singular, because Moses himself remained at the top of the hill praying to God. For this reason, it also says, choose for us in the singular. If so, why does the verse say, choose men for us in the plural?
So it's interesting. He tells them, choose men for us, but you yourself go out and battle Amalek. So what's the point of the men? What are the men doing? It's like, all right, we're doing a draft. Everybody come to the draft room. Okay, come. All right, Joshua, now you go yourself with your own sword and try to decimate Amalek. It's like, what? You drafted us. What are we doing here? What are we waiting around doing nothing? Well, let's see how the Jewish draft truly works.
The Alter Rebbe explains in Torah or that to wage the war against Amalek, Moses' men are required. Moses' men are people who endeavor and ensure that all aspects of their conduct are in accordance with Moses' instructions, beginning with the study of the Torah, about which the verse states, "Remember the Torah of Moses, my servant."
Ah, very interesting. So, how do you fight the war against Amalek? Yeah, you have to make a draft. There's a lot of controversy now around the Israeli draft, right? I don't know if you're following that. Familiar with that?
It's
The draft in the IDF. So, anyways,
here.
well, it's not exactly everybody. There are certain exemptions, and that's where there's a lot of political upheaval. Anyways, I'm not here to be the bearer of bad news. But what I am here to say is that this is what a Jewish draft truly looks like. You make a big draft, you gather everybody into the draft headquarters, and then they don't go out to war. That sounds silly. Like, what's the point of the draft? Are they on reserves? What's going on? The Rebbe says it's very simple. They are fighting the war. They're fighting the war not with swords, but with books. They're fighting the war of Moses by studying the Torah that Moses taught us. So Moses says, yes, go gather people so that you yourself can go fight Amalek. So Joshua's doing this whole draft, bringing in all these men, fighting men, but they don't fight. Just Joshua goes out to fight. Why? Because their Torah study is what causes the defeat of the enemy. I'm not sure if this is where the Rebbe is going over here. Yeah, actually, let's see. The Rebbe continues, keep going. Amalek, Refidim, as mentioned.
As mentioned above, the war with Amalek was fought in Rephidim, which alludes to their having weakened their hands.
Rafu Yedehem.
From the words of the Torah, from this it is clear that by strengthening ourselves in Torah study, and especially by toiling in Torah study, the toil of Torah cancels out the toil of Amalek.
Because remember, the word Amalek is Amal Klipa, the toil of the Klipa. So the Amalek attacked the Jewish people when they were in a place called Refidim. Now, the word Refidim comes from the word Rafu, which means they weaken. In other words, they weaken their grip on the words of Torah. And so this shows us that the Amalek-like force in our times can strike us specifically at a time when we are not engaged in Torah study, when we're disconnected, when we're not anchored in our Torah, in our teachings. That's a moment of weakness and vulnerability when it's easiest to attack us and persuade us to be unmoved by divine revelation. If we're not anchored in Torah study, if we're not constantly reiterating and restudying and just living with our teachings, then we can witness the greatest miracles in front of our eyes. We can witness hail come down from heaven, the Nile be split to blood, turn to blood, the Red Sea be split, beepers going off in Lebanon, and bombs dropped on nuclear facilities in Iran, and we just we blow our nose and it blows over. It's like nothing ever happened. So, what's the remedy for somebody who's been disease stricken by the Amalek disease, by the coldness and apathy disease? The antidote to that is to become a Moses man. That means to study Torah, to toil in Torah, and to follow the teachings of Torah. As the Rebbe continues, in addition, there is also the precise word choice of remember the Torah of Moses, my servant. That's, I believe, from the book of Joshua. It says, Zichru Torah Moshe Avdi. I'm not 100% sure where the quote is from, but it's from one of the prophets or writings. It says, remember the Torah of Moses, my servant, which refers to Torah study which involves intellectual understanding. For it is your wisdom and knowledge in the eyes of the nations. Intellectual understanding requires that a person express and assert themselves, but at the same time, a feeling of self-nullification and submission is also required. This is why the verse uses the words servant. Remember the Torah of Moses, my servant. It doesn't say, remember the Torah of Moses, my scholar, but it says the Torah of Moses, my servant. Because to truly study and absorb new knowledge, you have to be subservient to the one who's teaching. It is specifically through the self-nullification of Moses, my servant, that we reach true exaltedness. Self-exaltedness like a king without a crown, in a manner that transcends reason and understanding. This also leads to the obliteration of Amalek. This will first be achieved. First, it sounds like a redundancy over there. This will be achieved first in the personal divine service of every Jew, and then in the literal sense with the coming of our righteous Mashiach. At that time, the promise of I will utterly obliterate the memory of Amalek will be realized, and the kingdom shall belong to the Lord, may it be very soon. So today we experience Amalek in very tangible ways, as I was saying, with all those examples, with the miracles that we've seen throughout the world. And I think it's fair to say at this point, in retrospect, the capture of a tyrant dictator in Venezuela as well, with almost no repercussions, certainly not on the American side. I think that's also a tremendous miracle, and we have to give thanks to God that happened. And especially when we're talking about things that affect the Jewish people and the land of Israel, or specifically the multitude of millions of Jews who live in the land of Israel, and how these events in Iran and Hezbollah that happened, which were totally unpredicted by anybody. Most Jews, when they saw that happen, they saw the hand of God. We all experienced a revelation of godliness. The fact that all that could work so impeccably and so perfectly, it really makes us appreciate God Almighty being on our side. But then time passes and we forget about it, and Amalek comes and starts giving us newfound explanations of why it had nothing to do with God. And that's Amalek trying to detach us from the divine revelation in our lives. And that's something that we have to be very careful from. We have to watch out and not forget that this is Amalek trying to infiltrate our belief system. Now, similarly, during the 1991 Gulf War, I don't remember it very well because I was busy screaming between diapers. But the Jewish people were in a very similar situation. There were wars going on between global powers, and there was lots of fear all around. But in practice, events unfolded very quickly. The enemy was defeated almost without losses in the land of Israel. And the war ended much earlier than expected, in fact, on the holiday of Purim. And about 10 days later, in a public letter, the Rebbe wrote the following greeting. Source 6, greeting and blessing. As we approach the holiday of Purim, a time of miracles in those days and in our time, that's a quote from the blessing on the Megillah, it is an appropriate time to pay attention to the great miracles that occurred in recent days. These are open miracles perceived not only by the Jewish people, but by all nations. A great miracle for the good of the Jewish people and the world at large. If I recall correctly, there were 39 Scud missiles that were shot at Israel, and none of them caused any casualties. Further in this letter, the Rebbe details those miracles. He says, number one, it would have been expected for this war to draw in many nations and further inflame matters into a world war, God forbid. However, miraculously, not only was a world war prevented, but the war that broke out subsided. Number two, B. Despite all signs pointing to a difficult, protracted war that would require a massive army with sophisticated weaponry, The war was over in a very short time. And thirdly, C, this stunning victory prevented great bloodshed among the other nations, and the enemy even freed past prisoners of war. And the Rebbe adds, moreover, those familiar with the goings-on behind the scenes who have access to classified information understand the magnitude of these miracles even greater. So this is the same point that we're studying here, that we have to recognize the revelation of godliness in a miracle and internalize it. We can't allow the Amalek to cool us off, the Klippa to cover over the reality of God within all those things, but we have to act upon it. And when we see these kind of things, we have to think deeply and apply the message of these sights and these happenings to ourselves and say, what does this demand from me right now? In what way can I show gratitude to God? In what way is God calling out to me and saying, you see, I'm involved in your life. I'm involved in everything that's happening, and inspire us, lift us to want to say thank you, God, in return, and increase in our Torah, in our tefillah, in our prayer, in our tzedakah, and all the mitzvahs that we do to show that we are also reciprocating the love that God is showing us and the miracles He's giving us, that we can also show Him some love by doing His will in the best way possible. And that is a little lesson that can be learned from a often overlooked portion of this week's Torah portion, which has so much action, splitting of the sea, and this and that, and the manna, and that Amalek lesson is also very, very important. We have to watch out for that and make sure that we keep the inspiration of the miracles and let that